continue, but I wanted today's theme, through Lent, these have just been very informal conversations about how the virus has been a teacher to us if we've had our eyes open. And so today's theme is, why is it difficult to talk about hard things? And I say that because soon after we were quarantined, well, not soon after we'd been quarantined 8 or 9 weeks, you know, we were all kind of sequestered. And then there was the images in Minneapolis of George Floyd's neck being asphyxiated for 8.5 minutes. And there was a way in which we couldn't be distracted by everything else that was going on in our lives. Once again, we were faced with some of the realities of race. And it was certainly not my plan, but this is the Sunday, of course, immediately after the Asian American hate crimes, the most egregious example of that. But, you know, we were, you know, people who had not been on the streets since the 60s in the Vietnam War even took to the streets in the middle of this, the Black Lives Movement protests. But we were also then faced with friends and family who probably have a very different persuasion than we do, who have completely different ideas than most of us on this call. So my focus was just talking about difficult things. And I wanted, of course, always to locate it, though, in a time when the church talked about incredibly difficult things. In the chat, can you chat the text here? This is from Acts 15. And I didn't know if somebody would be willing to, can you see it? And if you can see it, if somebody would be willing to read it for the rest.
We're not seeing it.
You can't
You said
see
it's in the chat?
Yeah, it's in the chat. Why can't everybody
Not
see
according to us, it's not.
No.
Well, I was hoping to be real clever and put it in the chat. What have I done wrong here?
Did you not send it to everyone, maybe?
No, it's everyone on it. So let's.
Okay, it hasn't come up.
Oh,
Oh, there it is. There it is.
Well, I have to hit the enter button. Pam Howell, can you see it? Is it large?
Yes.
Can you read this?
Yes.
Read it for us, if you would.
Okay, then certain individuals came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And after Paul and Barnabas had no dissension and debate with them, Paul and Barnabas and some of the others were appointed to go up to Jerusalem to discuss this question with the apostles and the elders. So they were sent on their way by the church, and as they passed through both Phoenicia, I guess, Phoenicia and Samaria, they reported the conversation of the Gentiles and brought great joy to all believers. When they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and the elders, and they reported all that God had done with them. But some believers who belonged to the sect of the Pharisees stood up and said, it is necessary for them to be circumcised in order to keep the law of Moses. The apostles and the elders met together to consider this matter. After there had been much debate, Peter stood up and said, that's all there is.
Okay, I thought I got verse 7, but
that's part of verse 7, but not the end of it, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know why it all didn't show up there.
Peter stood up and said to them something.
I actually like that it stops there because I think it's always important to read through the lines when the church is reporting about something, because this was a meeting in which a lot of scholars looking back say that the whole future of the church was hanging in the balance. And it was a conversation about race and ethnicity and inclusiveness. I think a lot of us grew up in the church thinking, you know, we were taught that the early church was persecuted and that was the main threat to the church. It's not really borne out historically that there was all that widespread persecution. The main issue for the church and its greatest threat was internal. How are we going to resolve this racial difference between allowing Gentiles and Jews to congregate together in one community? That barrier was pretty strong. And the church somehow, some historians will even say that this probably would have, the church would have gone under if they had not found a creative solution going forward. So here we are in the United States, struggling once again with the realities of the fact that if we identify as white, we are in a position of much more privilege than someone who's Asian American, who's Black, who's Hispanic. And so we have the sympathy at Sixth about we need to be inclusive, we need to be aware of racial justice and reconciliation. But then we get into conversations we have with people that we know, people that we love, people that we care about, people that we look up to, and they have a different viewpoint about all of this. And so I was just wondering, how have you managed these conversations with people? And what have you attempted to do, recognizing that deciding not to have a conversation about these things is a reasonable strategy?
I can't tell if that's a fox.
Oh, it's interesting. It's not exactly conversations, but in a way it is. I have 3 nieces. My brother married a Korean woman in Korea. So those 3 nieces are half Korean. My oldest niece was actually born in Korea, but on Air Force Base. So she's obviously American citizen. And, they came to the United States when she was 2. So her mother is here, full Korean, and she talked about her, and Ginny is my niece, and this was all on Facebook, and she said, I'm not allowed or let out of what I actually am. It doesn't come up much, but she is half 100%, half Korean, completely. And she said one of her sisters said to her, do you see yourself as a woman of color even? So the question for them is, would they see it? Now, obviously their mother was very afraid, was often afraid even before COVID, was very afraid when COVID started and all the Asian, that kind of thing. My niece said, she definitely knows she grew up with white privilege, even though she's half Korean. And so just this whole conversation starting, because when I read that this morning, I hadn't even, when I heard about the thing in Atlanta, I hadn't even thought of my nieces, and the Asian part of my nieces, which obviously I know, but I just never thought of it that way. And that they could see themselves as women of color, and, stuff like that was just really kind of mind boggling. So that you're talking about this is interesting, and I don't quite have my head around it. Because this is family.
And let me just interject before somebody wants to say, I resonate so much with that story because
I know.
because my grandmother was from Mexico, my grandfather was from India, but my mother made it very clear, while we wouldn't have used the terminology whiteness, my mother wanted to gloss over all of those kinds of ethnic identities, and she would always say, we're Americans. Mm-hmm. And so I found it really fascinating because she made a conscious decision not to raise us bilingually and to kind of, while maintain the ethnicity in terms of food we ate, not really about anything else. The idea was assimilate because, and I think my mother intuitively understood that whiteness was the way to go in order to, so I feel some affinity with the dilemma of your nieces there. Mm-hmm. It's been something that's been really hard for me to kind of sort out for myself.
And can I ask, your father was white though, correct?
Oh yeah, my father's white and I've got a German last name. So
right. Yeah, you don't have a Hispanic name at all.
My father was very conservative politically. So right away around the dinner table, we got into a lot of battles because obviously I was wired differently and I would take issue with him. And so, here's my father who watched nothing but Fox News for the last 10 or 12 years of his existence. And, do some of you have, relatives that are, obviously different, and how do you navigate all that?
I do with my sister. She is a big supporter of, I can't even think of his name. And she liked Rush Limbaugh, and she always quoted him to us. And I decided one day I would just tell her what I thought and then let the whole thing go. And that sort of worked for us. Trump was the name I was coming up with. He was a big Trump supporter.
How did she respond? And you said, let it go. So how did that work? Did you agree for that not to be an area of conversation between the two of you? Because I mean, that's the way we keep peace with people that we love, right?
Yeah, right. No, we just automatically did it. Just stopped. Because I knew I wasn't going to change her mind, and she knew she wasn't going to change mine. So we just didn't talk about it.
Maggie, you had your hand up, I noticed. Did you want to say something?
Oh, I took the chicken way out. I just don't bring it up with my Republican relatives. So.
And I don't want you to be immediately saying that that's the chicken way out. I mean, we're trying to navigate really difficult kinds of things. And so I don't want you to hear in what you said kind of some self-recrimination, but I wouldn't think of that. I wouldn't think of it that way.
Yeah. I have a few nieces that are more on our side, but they seem to do the same thing. It's just that's when we have family gatherings, that's just not topics that come up. So we navigated by avoiding it, but that's not entirely good. I keep thinking about trying to find a non-attacking way to bring up the subject, but I haven't thought of it yet.
I agree with you, Maggie. That's the way we've navigated in my family too, of just by avoiding it.
I have a perspective on having difficult conversations, and it comes not from like topics of politics or social issues, but more the way I was raised in my career. I worked for a very German company and very German leadership. And it was not uncommon to be called an idiot in front of everybody. And that's a dumb idea. And I soon learned the importance of separating myself from the idea or the topic. So I'm pretty good at like, you can't touch me because this idea is not me. Mm. And so relating that to, so like I can do that in a technical space. And I don't know if you've seen me do it on anything church related, but I can do that. And I recognize that not everyone can, but I can separate myself from a topic. Now, when it comes to relating that to social issues or it's things of that nature, again, I'm comfortable to have a difficult discussion. And sometimes I've led it with, this is going to be a difficult discussion, and letting people know this isn't going to be comfortable. And I mean, in my family, we're as white as they come, and we don't have anything controversial within our family, except for my parents raised a bunch of bleeding heart liberals and they're a bunch of conservative Republicans. So that's interesting. But on the topic of, and sometimes it's just at the point where I've gotten of like, we're not going to agree on this. So I'm just not going to talk about it anymore. And Maggie, I don't think it's a chicken out mechanism at all. I think it's preserving our relationships.
Yeah, I agree.
So far it's been there, but I think there's a certain amount of unreality about it. You know?
that's a real helpful sense of, can I separate myself from the topic, which is very difficult to do when I have strong feelings about something correctly. But if I can go into this and say, we're going to have a conversation about this as an idea, and I'm not going to allow myself to be hooked by that, that's a great strategy. Do some of you have some responses to what Sarah shared, or just your own life experience as you've navigated difficult conversations? I mean, we have some very wise, experienced people on this call who've had to have difficult conversations. How have you done all that?
This is just kind of a footnote. Every time I have we have one of our Bible studies or Sunday school sessions, I just love these. I love these sessions. I would miss one because I always learn things. For example, Pam, I've known you and Kirk for what, 30 years? A long time. And I've heard about your brother so many times. And I never knew that there was he married a Korean lady. Of course, we have that in my family. We have an international marriage. And I've known Sarah and Joe for, I don't know, 20 years. Long time. And I never knew that you worked for a German company. Of course, I had the same experience. You're a woman working for a German company. I was a man. So I had the same experiences with Germans many times. That's all. I keep learning things about people that I've known for 20 and 30 years. Really important things that are common with me.
There's a really important book we were talking about it Wednesday. Peter Gilmore said this speaker is actually going to be at PTS in May. Valerie Kaur, she is the daughter of a Sikh. That's an ethnic group within India, and it's a book called See No Strangers. And one of the quotes, I could find it quickly, but she talks about the need to maintain a capacity for wonder about people who are different. And she doesn't speak about this as just, comfortable conversation. She talks about learning this from her father, who endured really some significant persecution by virtue of being a Sikh and being Indian. And the fact that he was not willing to retaliate for some horrific things that happened to him. And he said, you really have to keep open a sense of wonder about a person who's a stranger to you. So I think about when I see my Facebook feed that's filled with lots of people who think like I do, and the ways that we caricature the positions that other people take without having any sense of curiosity about how they arrived at that. I don't know if that makes any sense to you.
In my personal life, I'm less capable of separating the ideas and issues from me personally, because to me, rightly or wrongly, they identify who I am. And yet, on a professional level, happening every day nearly, I am able to do that. And it's really necessary, because I am currently employed by a university that is the citadel of right-wing Catholicism. And so there are a number of my students express ideas that are alien to me in oh so many ways, sometimes challenging the not so latent anti-Catholicism with which I was raised. But I cannot, for many reasons, respond to them in a partisan or vituperative or personal basis, even though in my head I'm saying, you stupid idiot. But I can't, obviously. So, I'm wearing my historian hat. And so I say, well, there are other things in the record that we need to be aware of. So have you considered this? Or, this past week, the assignments included reading Andrew Jackson's order that the Cherokee be removed, and also excerpts from Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And some fashion they were supposed to bring these two together. And some students sadly took Jackson at face value. Most of them, though, saw that he was, lying through his teeth and, faking this any kind of humanitarian posture before having the troops forcibly remove people from their homes. Unfortunate, but there was those students who said, agreeing with Jackson, the Cherokee just wouldn't adapt. Unfortunately, the textbook doesn't help matters. So I had to add, well, did you know that the Cherokee adopted a written language, a constitution, a representative government? They had a newspaper. So many became farmers. Some even owned slaves. How much more could you adapt to white society than they did? But I didn't, the idea, of course, was not to be accusatory, not to be inflammatory, not to be derogatory, but say there are other things that we might want to consider when putting all this together. And that's been the pattern throughout this semester, and I did the same course last semester as well. So again, in the midst of COVID, which, by the way, presented other issues. Many students complaining of the attack on the freedom of religion because churches were closed. And I've tried to be very restrained about that. Well, just once I responded by saying, well, I consider myself using my Christian liberty to not inflict disease on sisters and brothers. Just left it at that.
That's a marvelous way, but one of the things I pick up with this, and I'm going to have to leave, I have to go down for the live stream, so I'm apologizing for leaving what's an interesting discussion, but I encourage you to continue it for as long as you want. Part of what I hear in what Peter said is truth-telling, that we have to tell some truth that people don't know about what was going on with the Cherokee Nation. And the other piece of that, as we look at the Asian American event, is the Presbyterian Church. Have any of you been to Montreat, North Carolina, which is the largest and most beloved camp and conference center in the denomination? Well, in the 1940s, the Presbyterian Church volunteered for the government that would be a detention center for Japanese citizens who were deemed to be a threat to the country.
Oh my.
So, truth-telling that we've played a part in all of this, unfortunately, is a reality. So, continue on. I've got to go downstairs. It's good to see all of you, and we'll have another conversation I'll tell you about next week, but please continue. Sorry, I'm leaving.
Peter, it's interesting. The advantage you have, at least these students are in college and discovering there may be some other ideas than what they grew up with. My brother, who did 20 years in the service and became a sergeant, but never really went to college. His three daughters, these three half Korean daughters, all did go to college. And he feels that it was college who indoctrinated them to believe something different than his very conservative views. In fact, he told me, and this has really got me, he said he was confusing sociology and socialism. He insisted that everybody that went to college had to take sociology, and that's why they all had socialism bents. He did not even know the difference between those two words. So he feels that people like your students or anybody that goes to college are being brainwashed. And that's part of the problem, which just fascinated me, but that he didn't understand the difference between sociology and socialism. And I did look up just for the heck of it, and not all colleges require sociology. But he believed that. He got it from somewhere, probably Fox News, or some one of those kinds of things. But he truly believed that that's why his girls turned against him, was because of college and, you know, being indoctrinated with the wrong ideas in his view. So I don't even know how you answer that.
Yeah. Well, my father had pretty much the same idea. The sociology part didn't come up, but in general, that university was responsible for all of my crazy ideas. You know, despite the fact that there was a terrible war going on in Southeast Asia, that the university was located in a minority neighborhood, and there was rampant poverty all around me. I mean, a thinking person might start putting things together and begin to ask questions. Yes, there were experiences on campus that contributed to the process. Learning things in general contributed to the process, but he was convinced it was the university.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, you know, it makes it much harder to try to get through. And some of it, I mean, rightly or wrongly, I think is college education. You know, being exposed to other ideas.
Mhm.
You have to be exposed to them to be able to think about them. If you're never even exposed, you don't even, it's harder to
Things to think.
Yes.
You know, something just occurred to me. I'm fascinated by these stories, Pam, especially that brother. I want to meet that brother.
He lives in Arizona.
Well, that brother reminds me of a lot of my relatives who are totally impossible. You know, when we go to visit my cousins in North Carolina, we walk in, Fox News is on the television, it doesn't get turned off ever. My poor wife, think about what she has to put up with. And to make it more interesting, these people are all elders in the Presbyterian Church. So we haven't really gotten into that. Vincent's Bible text about the Apostolic Council on the Greeks and the Jews, you know, that's a church issue, and that's a big issue. How do we deal with conflict in the church? I don't have the answer. It just occurred to me, my family members are also Presbyterians. So we discuss church politics with great intensity.
It's really interesting what you add, Cliff. And Pam and Peter, sometimes I turn it against my parents and say, well, that's what you get for wanting independent women, because you taught us to think, and, you know, just making light of it.
Right.
But, you know, it is interesting just thinking about having the difficult conversation and addressing what's going on. You know, when my children go to Pittsburgh public schools and their closest friends are not white. And last summer, when George Floyd happened, I reached out to two moms of the little boys that I love, that are Louis' friends. And I just said, you know, I don't know what to say, but I love your sons. I love their skin. I love everything about them. And I just want you to know that. And, you know, yesterday, it's been a year, and Sadie had a friend come over, and it was just amazing because they were outside and little girls talking, and like it just did amazing things. But I was driving home after dropping this child off, and I thought, I didn't say anything because I don't see it, but her dad is Asian, her mom is white, and it never occurred to me to say, man, I'm sorry about what happened in Atlanta. And I didn't think to say that to them. And is that something that we should say, like, to your nieces, like, I love you for who you are, but should, you know, I didn't even think, I'm now thinking about, man, should I like text the dad and say, hey, I'm sorry I didn't address it yesterday? Is that the right thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I never, until she wrote that, I didn't even think of that, you know, even though obviously I know their background. You know? So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I have a good friend who is her parents, she was born in Korea. She's American. She's a surgeon actually. And we were talking one time about the comments that she gets, like racially charged comments about being a lady Asian surgeon. And she was like, you'd think that all of her degrees and care of people, that like people would just stop talking about it, but they still see her as different. Which, and then I was like, well, I think I'm glad I should see you as different, right? I should celebrate that about her. But like you said, it didn't occur to me then, and now I'm just really thinking about this.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you could put it back to a Black friend or something too. Like when George Floyd happened, do you say something to the parent of the little Black boys? You know what I mean? And I actually have a half Black niece that has decided to reject us. She's, for whatever reason, she's very confused because she's half white and half Black, and she doesn't know what she is, basically. And whatever, there's some other reasons, but she's chosen not to have a relationship with us, even though her mother does. And it could be something I did or how I treated her or whatever. It was inadvertently, but who knows? Not understanding maybe the Black perspective. I saw her as just a human being, and was my niece. So yeah, we have a very international family. And just one funny story that doesn't quite go in, but Melina was about 6, I guess, and we were going to meet Ginny, my niece, for the first time because she had been born in Korea and was now in Pittsburgh, but we had never met her. And we did have some pictures, and Melina ran in and looked at the picture because she also had a cousin that was half Black that was older than this niece. And she says, I just wanted to see what color she was. Because they're all different colors.
I love that. I love that child innocence, but I love that, like, okay, what,
because
this is like the process, and it's,
yeah, it was, and because we hadn't met her yet, and so
Pam, this is a niece of a different sibling, right?
yeah, my brother's is the one that married the Korean and then has 3 children that are half Korean. My sister married a Black man, and that niece is from her.
And the niece that has issues with you and Kirk, do you mind if I ask how old the child is?
Oh, she's in her 30s.
Oh, she's in her 30s. Oh.
Yeah, she's only like a year or 2 younger than Melina.
Okay, very good. I find this so fascinating. As you all know, I lived in a foreign country for quite a few years, and there was never a single day living there that I didn't feel like an American. And my daughters, both, they spent 5 years in the schools there and they had many, many friends, and they were fluent in the language, and they never, ever, ever for one single second stopped feeling American. And by golly, they were going to go back to America, and they were Americans. They were totally not integrated.
How did you, I'm not sure what the question is. So you just felt as an outcast? I mean, how did you feel American? What was the feeling, or what did they say the feeling was?
Well, everything was very amiable. We were the most important allies of this country. But that's why I'm fascinated by Sarah's story, because I would get all these, aggressive comments about Ronald Reagan. And I began to realize finally things that would be very rude in Pittsburgh were not considered rude in that culture. Things that seemed confrontational, angry, they're trying to get in touch with me. That's how people get in touch.
I see.
They're just very aggressive. The way they interact is very aggressive. And of course, I'm a man. Sarah's a woman. I was in
but we
culture.
had, I mean, this was the thing that I really appreciate about that culture, and it might have just been my workplace, but you could have a very difficult confrontational discussion, yelling, and then we'd all go have a beer. And it was not anything personal that I thought your idea was stupid. It was just, you had a stupid idea and we need to discuss why, and we need to move forward. Okay, we resolved that. Now let's go have a beer and get some dinner. Then we go back to work the next morning and move forward. And
That was exactly my
there's some
experience. That what in an American company would be confrontational with these folks was not confrontational. That's just the way.
right. And when I worked for an American company, then it was like, well, maybe you might want to think about trying something different, or maybe you should think about sometime doing it different, and really overly nice and not wanting to hurt somebody's feeling, when it was just like, let's just talk about this. Let's talk about it.
Interesting.
And I think in personal relationships, and when we're talking about social topics, let's just talk about it. Tell me why you see me as a white person in a nice neighborhood with whatever. Why does that bother you? Why, what, or why is that something different? And I've had my eyes opened a lot about my white privilege in the last year, and especially the times of just being around different people. So I don't know how to translate that to the social issues, but I'm just like, let's just talk about it. And if I say something that's like you don't like, it's not because I don't like you. Let's just talk about the topic.
Diana, I wonder about your experiences
Yeah.
with China and stuff.
Oh my gosh. I'm just sitting here thinking about what's worthwhile to say.
Probably everything, Diana. I want to hear it.
Since my academic specialty is Asia and East Asia, so that's Japan, China, Japan, and Korea. It's all very the cultural traits and so forth, with so much traveling back and forth and spending time there. And we've had Chinese people living with us. It all seems a non-issue to me. I mean, their culture, there are very many aspects of their culture that are different from ours, but not offensive, really, once you're familiar with them. And we've been responsible here in the United States for introducing some Chinese people who came here and stayed for kind of a long time to our culture, and they adapted really well. So I don't know, I read a lot of things that are about the way things go in China, and I guess what is it that would be most, well, to be on your own, if you're alone, if you're traveling around alone on transportation and so forth. I never found it a problem. I didn't really enjoy it because there was so much that you had to, first there were the language issues that you had to be clear about. But I always found people reasonably helpful, but they were more helpful to me because I was non-Chinese. I was a person who was visiting and clearly not amazingly fluent with the language. So they would help me with directions if necessary. The cultural trait that I observed, particularly in China, where I spent most of the time, was that among themselves, they're not what we would call polite. It's a very crowded place. I mean, not in the villages, but in the cities, it's very crowded. And so you're passing lots and lots of people. And it's what I feel here in the States, making eye contact with certain people and, smiling and so forth, and riding on the buses and stuff like that. It's just a familiar sort of, and you're not trying to make a friendship, you're just trying to be pleasant. And they pretty much don't do that, so that they have learned how to live in dense population centers, and they keep with the people they're with or go about their business. And we would call them a little insensitive to other people. And my reading on that is it's a cultural trait if it's not a member of your family that you're connected to. And they're very, at least in China, and also in the other two countries I mentioned, but they're very conscious of who they're related to blood-wise. And it can go for, many generations and people living in different areas because of the long history. So that was different. That was different and not particularly comfortable for me. So those would be my major comments. Can I answer it, Eric? Can I answer any questions, especially that?
We were, Nora and I were in, of all places, we were in Spain, and we thought we'll take a class to learn Spanish. Well, in the class, there were
We
the
can't.
majority of,
Yeah, whatever that noise is, I'm not sure whose house that noise is.
We've got an extra voice somewhere. Oh, go ahead.
can you hear me now?
Yeah. Okay. The other
Well,
sound. The other sound has gone away.
Oh, okay. Nora and I took a trip to Spain, and we took a class in Spanish.
Yeah.
So we were in Spain trying to learn Spanish. Good luck with that. And the class was full of Chinese folks who were not young kids. These were adults. They were in their 30s and 40s, mid-career people. The government was paying them for years in Spain to live there and learn Spanish. And the Chinese are serious about opening trade relationship with Spain. Those people are going to be fluent in Spanish. Well, we were the stars. We were by far the oldest people in the class. We were absolutely the stars. Oh, we got all this respect and we were wonderful. And they found that it was our anniversary, and they had a special party for us. We were honored because we were 3 times older than they were.
Yeah.
Well,
this is worth mentioning. I think that Chinese, particularly, the culture is 3,000 years old. Can trace it all the way back. But that education has always been a huge value, but attainable historically by a very small percentage of the population. But they were in charge of things, so they had an exam system, and their what we would call political leaders, their emperor and so forth, the advisors to the emperor were people who had passed this exam. And sometimes it worked very honestly, and sometimes, it got corrupted a little bit. But anyway, now that has changed. Now it's the party. And so they really look to the party people. And there's something new going on. What's going on right now is since 2012, and the guy who is the head for life, he's gotten it changed. So he's the leader for life, is moving in a very authoritarian direction, which is traditionally understandable, except the local areas had historically a lot of power in the village that you lived with or the small town that you lived in. It didn't just come from the top.
It's interesting. It made me think about, the family values and that what you said. And somebody else said also about, they adapted well to our culture. And, even that's a questionable statement. Like, why do people have to adapt to our culture, first of all? But one of the things that came across with my family, first of all, you know, my brother married this Korean girl. She came to the US. You know, they had 3 children and then they divorced, but she stayed in the US. So I had not seen her. I still saw my brother and my nieces and that kind of thing, but I had not seen her for many years. But when my father was dying and my nieces, I think it was just my nieces. I think my brother was farther away or whatever, but my nieces came in to see my father. Their mother came too. And the reason is she still considered him family.
Mhm.
She had married my brother. And that just like was, wow.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I thought that was an amazing thing. I mean, we hadn't seen her at that point, you know, for maybe 15 years or something, you know, but she considered him family and still came in. And so, you know, you wonder this whole thing about adapting to our culture, maybe some of the things isn't as good to adapt to.
Yeah. Family ties are very, very strong.
Right. But that just amazed me because I
Yeah.
did not expect that. You know, I thought it was wonderful she did it, but obviously that wasn't something I expected.
Yeah. One of the things that I should mention to you, I'll hold it up. Can you see the title of this book?
Choosing Daughters.
Yeah. So the class that I'm teaching now, yeah, there it is, Choosing
Yeah.
Daughters. And it's written by a Chinese, I think she was raised in this country, but her background is Chinese, so going back. It's a dissertation work. So it's written very well, but it's written like this is the product that she's produced about a village in northern China. So the area called Manchuria, which is north of Beijing and, you know, way up in the north. But the point is, and makes it so interesting to use, this is with teachers. These are people who teach at all different levels in the systems in many states. And the point is that in that village, they have within the last 10 years, really kind of moved to favor daughters. Much that they want to have daughters and they're willing, excuse me, willing to have one child. And of course, one child was, I'm sure a lot of you know this, but that under when Mao was in power, he enforced that. One child only. Now it's officially, but only in the last 5 years or so, 2. Okay. So there was always pressure to try to have a male offspring, because that had been thousands of years of history. And in this village, they are kind of unique, I think, because I do not believe as you move further south, I think that you don't also have that belief that it's best to have one daughter, because the daughters marry out of the family they're born in and they become part of the husband's family. So that is something that's very different, I think, from what we have in our culture. But that's breaking down with the modernization of the last 15 or 20 years. So actually, this book is wonderful because the teachers, when they, this is all online, when they respond, they frequently cite information from their own personal background. So they'll talk about the number of children they had, the issues that came up, the controversies that existed, etc. So it makes it's turning out to be a very successful book for many people, I think, in the group so far.
That is just a very moving story. And Pam, your story, that is just a moving story. I didn't know that the marriage didn't last. I mean, that would make just your point. The story you told could be a novel. It could be a movie. The daughter-in-law comes after 15 years, feels the love for her father-in-law. That is such an amazing, moving human story. I cannot tell you how moving that is. And it's real life, you know, nobody made that up.
That's the big value of a discussion like this, because
I know.
we hear those things and we wouldn't know them. We wouldn't.
Right. Of course not. Yeah.
Yeah. And Donna, your story is fascinating. When we were in Spain, in this town, this group of 8 or 9 Chinese folks, the ringleader was a woman. We had heard about patriarchal Chinese culture. They did whatever she told them. Those guys, as she said, do it, they did it. Man, she was the boss.
Well, this book is filled with stories like that, because the woman who wrote it, must have started her research after 2000. So it's very, very recent. And she lived there 3 different time periods because she had a family connection through her grandfather, I think, had actually grown up in this village. So that's several generations, but she was taken in and she lived with different people. And she was obviously very effective at getting along with people, but she learned these personal stories and she inserts them at the beginning of each chapter. So she's talking about important research issues, but she starts with a personal story. That's very helpful.
That is helpful.
This is such a fascinating discussion.
Good, good.
I think we better break it off though. It's 10 minutes to the.
Yeah.
So it was.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.